Look, on this show I've often asked, do we actually have a communications minister, a minister overseeing the ABC? I've asked because if we did, we would have heard this minister say to our national taxpayer-funded broadcaster, "You're too biased." And we would have heard him say, "You're also too big." And a national broadcaster that biased and that big, I mean, 4 national radio stations, 5 TV stations, 54 local radio stations, huge online newspaper, and ABC, that big and biased, is a menace to democracy, stifling debate, putting rivals out of work. In fact, just today, AAP, Australian Associated Press, news gathering agency, been around for 85 years, has had to shut down. Nearly 200 staff out of work, not including all the freelancers. And the reason? It says it can't make money competing against all that free news on the internet. And who produces a lot of the free news here because they're taxpayer funded? Your ABC. But it seems that we do have a communications minister after all, and his name is Paul Fletcher. And the reason I now know he's the communications minister is because he's actually had a very good brainwave. The ABC wants even more money from him now, on top of the $1 billion a year that we taxpayers already have to give it. It wants to be bigger, bigger, bigger. And Fletcher has said, well, if you want more cash, why don't you, the ABC, get it by simply selling your big, shiny studios in inner city Melbourne and Sydney and wherever, and then move out to the suburbs. It's cheaper out there. Make some money. And the ABC, the broadcaster of the urban elite, well, I have to say, it isn't happy.
Former Prime Minister Paul Keating says your intervention demonstrates ideological contempt for the ABC.
I'm encouraging them to consider the issue of where ABC operations are located and whether there are opportunities to withdraw capital from existing property, reallocate it in building a purpose-built new facility with the very latest technology.
Joining me on Newswatch is Gerard Henderson, head of the Sydney Institute, columnist with the Australian newspaper and author of the Media Watchdog blog. Gerard, moving the ABC to the suburbs, a good idea?
Well, I think it is a good idea. We've discussed it on this program before. Can I just say, initially, I noticed Paul Keating's comment then. When Paul Keating was Prime Minister, he used to talk to me on occasions about the ABC. He was highly critical of the ABC, as were members of the Hawke Labor government and then subsequently the Keating Labor government. So I think he's changed his position a bit. Look, I think Paul Fletcher is talking about a commercial decision. He's very experienced in communications, and what he's saying makes a lot of sense. I think on the program some time ago, I had a bit of a joke and said maybe they should move the headquarters out to Penrith in Sydney. And what Mr Fletcher, according to the report in the 9 newspapers today, is possibly talking about is saying, well, there's space around Parramatta, which is a major part of Sydney. It's actually the central part of Sydney. So I think from an economic point of view, it makes a lot of sense because the ABC is continuing to go to the government saying $1 billion a year isn't enough. We want top-ups on that. And the minister is saying, well, there are other ways to rearrange yourself. In Sydney, Channel 9 has moved its headquarters and downgraded, and in a technical sense it's upgraded, but in terms of property it's made money. Channel 7's done the same. But the ABC seem to think it should keep these very expensive properties particularly in Sydney and Melbourne and other places. And the minister's simply saying, well, if you sold them off, you'd make some money, you wouldn't have to sack some staff, and it would be a good economic idea. And then there's the cultural matters as well.
Yeah, well, look, the Herald Sun moved at least its printing presses many years ago out of the city into the burbs. The Age newspaper in Melbourne did the same. Now, Paul Fletcher, as we saw in that clip, didn't want to comment on ideological war with the ABC, but wouldn't it be the case that moving the ABC to the suburbs wouldn't just save money, you would expect it to have an ideological effect as well, simply by virtue, maybe, of the ABC having to share bus and train lines with ordinary Australians every day out into the burbs?
Well, as you know, the ABC in Sydney and Melbourne is very intercity, and many, if not a majority of the people who work at the ABC, who are journalists and reporters and presenters and producers, they live in the city. So they walk or bicycle or travel by train or tram in Melbourne from the inner city to South Bank, and it's much the same in Sydney. And I think this partly explains what has been termed the bubble. A lot of these people don't meet the kind of people who live in the suburbs or the regional towns, and so to put the ABC in a place like Parramatta in Sydney, or perhaps Tullamarine in Melbourne, would mean that the people who work there would either have to travel there, or if they chose to live there, they would live among ordinary Australians, what the Prime Minister calls the quiet Australians. That's where they would live, and they would meet people. And I think a lot of the judgments they would make, like, for example, in the lead up to the last federal election, they wouldn't make if they lived among their fellow citizens and not spend so much time living among each other or like-minded people, as occurs in the inner city of Melbourne and Sydney.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, there's a parallel here. I remember years ago, before we got overwhelmed with journalism schools, usually headed by people who didn't rise to prominence in that industry themselves, we used to have a predilection for picking cadets from the country, and it was often found that they worked harder and just had a broader view of Australia. And I think people, well, my generation would know that that's actually quite true, that a lot of country journalists were favoured and made very good careers. Last September, I don't know why the ABC is so upset with this idea of moving to the suburbs, because last September, ABC Chairman Ita Buttrose actually led an ABC conclave into the western suburbs of Sydney for a boot camp to connect with Australia. I reckon it should be glad of a permanent connection, a permanent cure, a permanent move there, don't you think?
Well, I think at the time I suggest they might just base themselves in Penrith, and it's not a silly idea. I mean, as Sydney moves, I mean, Penrith becomes closer to the centre of the whole of Sydney. I mean, at the moment it's probably Parramatta, but Sydney's moving in that direction. Look, it's not a bad idea, but I can't see it happening. But I mean, if Channel 9 can move, if Channel 7 can move, there's no reason why the ABC can't. I mean, the properties they have are fairly modern properties. They're probably 30 to 20 years old. They're not heritage buildings. There's no particular merit in these buildings. They're now becoming old in a technological sense, although they spend money changing them. I mean, it makes a lot of sense. There's no reason why the ABC needs to be an Ultimo or South Bank. And you see it when the ABC's an Ultimo at Q&A. I mean, unless they bus people in from the suburbs, as on occasions they've done, I mean, the audience reflects, for example, in Sydney, the people live around Sydney University, the University of Technology, Sydney. They're the people who overwhelmingly come into an audience like Q&A. So they keep on talking to one another.